You need to pack your things and get out of my house. This is my children's home, and I won't have some gold-digging replacement living in the space I built with their father." Rachel's voice carried across our front porch and into the quiet suburban afternoon like a declaration of war, loud enough for Mrs. Henderson next door to pause her gardening and Mr. Peterson across the street to look up from washing his car. My husband Tom's ex-wife stood on our doorstep with the righteous fury of someone who believed she held all the cards in a game I apparently didn't know we were playing. I'm Emma, 34 years old, a real estate attorney who fell in love with a divorced father and somehow found myself living in what felt like a house, with 3 adults making decisions about it, except only 2 of us were married and living here. Sometimes the most dangerous assumptions are the ones that sound reasonable until you examine the actual fact. Rachel had been letting herself into our house for the past 6 months, ever since Tom and I got married. Not breaking in. She still had keys from when she lived here with Tom during their 8-year marriage, keys that apparently no one had thought to ask her to return when she moved out 2 years ago. "Rachel, we've talked about this," I said, keeping my voice level despite the audience of neighbors who were pretending not to watch our domestic drama unfold in their peaceful Saturday afternoon. "You can't just come into our house whenever you want." "Our house?" Her laugh could have etched glass. "Honey, I picked out every tile in the kitchen, every paint color in the bedroom, every fixture in the bathroom. This house was my home for 8 years before you even existed in Tom's life." When someone confuses sweat equity with legal ownership, the conversation about property rights becomes illuminating. Rachel was 41, blonde in the way that required monthly maintenance, and dressed in the kind of athletic wear that cost more than most people's mortgage payments. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never been told that divorce papers transfer more than just marital status. They also transfer property rights. "I understand you have emotional attachment to this house," I replied carefully. "But legally?" "Legally?" Rachel stepped closer, her voice rising to a pitch that would definitely reach the Hendersons' kitchen window. "Let me tell you about legal, sweetheart. I lived here for 8 years. I made this house a home. I raised Tom's children. That gives me rights." Sometimes people believe that emotional investment creates legal claims, but property law doesn't typically work on sentimental principles. This wasn't our first conversation about boundaries, but it was definitely our most public. Rachel had been testing limits since Tom and I returned from our honeymoon to find she'd rearranged our living room furniture because it was better for the children's comfort during a visitation. When I gently mentioned that rearranging our furniture without permission felt invasive, Rachel had explained that she was just trying to maintain stability for the kids, and that some things were more important than territorial disputes between women. When someone frames boundary violations as child advocacy, questioning them becomes complicated even when the violations are clear. "Rachel, the children visit every other weekend and Wednesday evening. They don't need the furniture rearranged to feel comfortable." "How would you know what my children need? You've been in their lives for exactly 1 year. I've been their mother for 12 years. True statements used to justify problematic behavior often reveal more about the speaker's insecurities than about any actual needs being met. The worst part was that Rachel wasn't entirely wrong about something. She had lived in this house for 8 years. She had chosen the kitchen backsplash and the bathroom vanity and the paint colors that made each room feel warm and welcoming. Her children, Lily, 12, and Jake, 10, had grown up in these bedrooms, learned to ride bikes in this driveway, built blanket forts in this living room. But emotional history doesn't create legal ownership, and 2 years post-divorce, letting herself into our house to reorganize closets and rearrange furniture crossed lines that should have been established long ago. "I'm not questioning your role as the children's mother," I said, reaching into my purse for the folder I'd brought outside, specifically for this conversation. "But I am questioning your legal right to enter this property without permission." Rachel's eyes narrowed as she noticed the legal folder in my hand. "What's that supposed to be? Some kind of restraining order? You're going to try to keep me away from the house where my children visit their father?" "It's nothing that dramatic. Just some property documentation I thought you might find interesting." When someone's authority is based on assumptions rather than fact, introducing documentation tends to shift the conversation quickly. "Property documentation?" Rachel's voice carried the particular tone people use when they're confident they hold the moral high ground. "Emma, I don't care what paperwork Tom's lawyer drew up for your little marriage. This house was built with my sweat and my savings and my vision. You can't just erase 8 years of history with some legal document. Mrs. Henderson had given up all pretense of gardening and was now openly watching our conversation from her flower bed. Mr. Peterson had finished washing the same section of his car 3 times while monitoring our discussion. Sometimes the most important property disputes happen on front porches because no one can pretend the conversation isn't actually taking place. You're absolutely right that paperwork can't erase history, I agree, but it can clarify ownership, and ownership determines who gets to make decisions about keys and access and furniture arrangement. Ownership? Rachel's laugh held less confidence than it had 5 minutes earlier. Tom owns this house. We bought it together in 2018, and when we divorced, he kept the house, and I kept my equity in the settlement. That's an interesting interpretation of the ownership structure, I said, opening my folder with the deliberate care of someone who'd spent years presenting legal evidence, though not entirely accurate. So why did Rachel's sudden nervousness feel like the moment when confident assumptions about property rights were about to meet inconvenient facts about actual ownership? People often assume that real estate attorneys become real estate attorneys because we love paperwork and bureaucracy. But the truth is more personal. We become real estate attorneys because we understand that where you live determines how safe you feel, and legal protection creates the foundation for emotional security. When you've seen families destroyed by property disputes, you learn to value clear documentation over wishful thinking. I grew up in a house my grandmother lost during the 2008 financial crisis, not because she couldn't afford the payments, but because a mortgage company made clerical errors that took 2 years and most of her savings to resolve. Watching someone lose their home due to administrative mistakes taught me that property ownership is only as secure as the documentation that supports it. That's why, when Tom and I decided to move in together 8 months before our wedding, I insisted on handling all the real estate transactions myself. Experience with legal vulnerabilities tends to make people more careful about protecting themselves, not less trusting of good intention. Tom had been renting a small apartment since his divorce, while Rachel lived in their former marital home with the children. According to their divorce decree, Rachel had 60 days to either buy out Tom's half of the house or put it on the market for sale. She chose to sell, and the house sold quickly in our competitive suburban market. Tom received his equity from the sale and was ready to start fresh, but he was also worried about finding a place that would feel like home for his children during their visitation. When someone's primary concern is their children's emotional well-being, they often focus on familiar settings rather than optimal legal arrangements. That's when I found the perfect house, a 4-bedroom colonial in the same school district, 3 blocks from Tom's children's friends, with the same layout that Lily and Jake were used to, but updated finishes and a larger backyard for family activities. Tom loved the house but worried about qualifying for a mortgage so soon after his divorce settlement. His credit was good, but his debt-to-income ratio was complicated by child support and alimony payment. Financial reality after divorce often creates timing challenges that require creative solutions for people who want to move forward with their lives. I had different financial circumstances: no previous marriages, no children, no alimony obligation, and 8 years of successful real estate law practice had created substantial savings and excellent credit. I could qualify for a mortgage easily, and I could afford the down payment without liquidating investment accounts. So, I bought the house, in my name, with my credit, with my savings for the down payment. When someone can solve a practical problem while protecting everyone's financial interests, the arrangement often makes sense regardless of traditional expectations. Tom contributed to household expenses proportionally: utilities, groceries, maintenance costs. But the mortgage, property taxes, and homeowner's insurance were my responsibility. We planned to add his name to the deed after our wedding, but we never quite got around to the paperwork. Partly because we were busy planning a wedding and merging our lives in dozens of other ways. Partly because I was handling other clients' real estate transactions, and my own paperwork somehow always moved to the bottom of my priority list. Sometimes the most important legal documents are the ones we postpone because we assume we'll handle them eventually when we have more time. But mostly because Rachel's behavior made me hesitant to give up the legal protection that came with sole ownership. From the beginning, Rachel had treated our house like a satellite location for her own home. She would drop the children off for Tom's visitation weekends and linger for 20 or 30 minutes, checking what we'd changed, commenting on our decorating choices, rearranging items that weren't quite where she thought they should be. When someone treats your home like their workspace, the dynamic quickly becomes uncomfortable regardless of their stated intention. The kids are used to having their winter coats in the front hall closet, she'd mention while moving our coats aside to hang up Lily's jacket. It helps them feel more settled during transition. Jake's nightlight needs to be positioned exactly like this, she'd explain, while adjusting the lamp in his bedroom. Otherwise, he has trouble sleeping, and that affects everyone's weekend. This furniture arrangement blocks the natural traffic flow, she'd observe while nudging our coffee table to a different position. Small changes can make such a big difference in how comfortable everyone feels. When boundary violations are framed as child advocacy, objecting to them requires choosing between looking selfish and allowing inappropriate control. Tom, caught between wanting his children to feel comfortable and wanting his wife to feel respected in her own home, usually tried to find diplomatic middle ground that somehow left Rachel feeling heard and me feeling like my concerns weren't quite valid. She's just trying to help the kids adjust, he'd say after she'd reorganized our kitchen cabinets to match what Lily and Jake were used to at her house. Change is hard for children. If moving a few things around makes them feel more settled, it's probably worth the minor inconvenience. When someone's conflict avoidance strategy involves treating boundary violations as minor inconvenience, the violations tend to escalate rather than resolve. But the kitchen cabinet rearrangement was followed by Rachel reprogramming our television to include her streaming services so the children could access their shows, which was followed by her bringing over plants from her house to brighten up the living room during the children's visits, which was followed by her keeping a spare set of sheets and towels in our linen closet so she could refresh the kids' rooms if needed during their stays. Each individual boundary violation seems reasonable in isolation, but the pattern creates a dynamic where one person gradually assumes authority over another person's living space. 6 months after our wedding, Rachel still had keys to our house. She still felt entitled to enter our property whenever she deemed it necessary for the children's well-being. She still treated our home like a collaborative space where her opinions about arrangements held equal weight with ours, and I still owned the house entirely in my own name, with documentation that proved it. So why did standing on my own front porch listening to my husband's ex-wife demand that I leave feel like the moment when patient tolerance was about to meet legal reality? Property documentation? Rachel repeated, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're confident they understand something they haven't actually examined. Emma, I don't need to see Tom's paperwork to know this house was purchased with marital assets from our settlement. The assumption hung in the afternoon air like smoke, revealing everything about how Rachel had been conceptualizing property ownership since Tom and I moved in together. Sometimes the most illuminating moments happen when people explain their reasoning based on facts that aren't actually facts. That's an interesting theory about marital assets, I said, removing the first document from my folder, though it raises questions about timeline and funding sources. Mrs. Henderson had given up all pretense of gardening and was now sitting on her front porch steps, openly following our conversation like it was afternoon television. Mr. Peterson had moved on to washing his wife's car, but his movements were suspiciously slow and his attention was clearly focused on our property dispute. When neighborhood drama unfolds in broad daylight, witnesses stop pretending they're not watching. Timeline? Rachel's laugh had lost some of its earlier confidence. The timeline is simple. Tom and I divorced 2 years ago. He moved out, and 6 months later he bought this house with his share of our settlement money. Actually, the timeline is a bit more specific than that, I replied, studying the document in my hand. This house was purchased 14 months ago. The down payment was made from a single bank account, and the mortgage application lists only one borrower. Tom had joined us on the front porch, drawn outside by voices that were carrying farther into the neighborhood than anyone probably intended. His face showed the particular strain of someone who recognized that a conversation was heading somewhere uncomfortable, but wasn't sure how to redirect it. Emma, maybe we should discuss this inside, he suggested with the diplomatic tone of someone who'd spent 2 years trying to manage conflicts between the two most important women in his children's lives. Actually, I think this conversation belongs exactly where it is, Rachel said, stepping closer to examine the document in my hand. If Emma wants to wave paperwork around to make some point about property ownership, she can explain herself to the same neighbors who've watched me take care of this property for 8 years. When someone's authority is challenged in public, they often double down on their claims rather than acknowledging they might be operating with incomplete information. Rachel, I'm not trying to make a point about anything, I said calmly. I'm trying to share factual information about legal ownership that might clarify some misunderstandings about access rights. Misunderstandings? Her voice rose to a pitch that definitely reached the Hendersons' kitchen window. The only misunderstanding here is you thinking that 1 year of marriage gives you more rights to this property than 8 years of building a life and raising children? Tom was looking between Rachel and me like someone watching a tennis match where the ball was actually a small explosive device. Mom, what's happening? Lily appeared at our front door, 12 years old and clearly confused by the raised voices on her dad's porch. Behind her, 10-year-old Jake peered around the doorframe with the wide-eyed attention of someone who'd learned to monitor adult conflicts for signs of how they might affect his own life. When children appear during adult property disputes, the stakes of the conversation change immediately. Nothing's happening, sweetheart, Rachel said, her voice immediately softening into the tone she reserved for her children. The adults are just having a discussion about house rules. House rules that apparently include your mother entering our home without permission, I said quietly, aware that the children were listening but unwilling to allow Rachel's interpretation to stand uncorrected. Truth shared in front of children requires careful calibration between honesty and age-appropriate information. Emma, Tom said, his voice carrying warning. The kids don't need to be part of this conversation. You're right. The kids shouldn't have to hear conversations about appropriate boundaries because those boundaries should already be established and respected. Rachel's face flushed red. Boundaries? You want to talk about boundaries? I built this life. I made this house a home for these children. I chose every detail that makes this place feel familiar and safe for them. When someone's identity is deeply connected to a space they no longer legally control, discussions about access become conversations about worth and belonging. And you did a beautiful job, I said, meaning it. The house is lovely. Your taste in decorating and your attention to creating a comfortable family environment are obvious in every room. Rachel blinked, clearly not expecting acknowledgement of her contribution. But creating a beautiful family home doesn't transfer ownership rights, and it doesn't create permanent access privileges after divorce. Recognition of someone's contributions can coexist with clear boundaries about ongoing authority. Look at this document, I continued, holding up the paper so Rachel could see the official letterhead and legal formatting. This is the property deed filed with the county recorder's office 14 months ago. Rachel stepped closer, squinting at the document with growing confusion. The purchaser listed on this deed is Emma Louise Harrison, not Tom Harrison. Not Tom and Emma Harrison, just Emma Harrison. Sometimes the most powerful evidence is simply official documentation that contradicts widely held assumptions. The silence that followed was complete. Even the neighborhood sounds seemed to pause. No lawnmowers, no children playing, no cars passing on our usually busy suburban street. Tom was staring at the deed with an expression somewhere between surprise and recognition, as if he was remembering something he'd known but hadn't thought about for months. Rachel was reading the document with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit together the way she'd expected. That's not possible, she said finally. Tom bought this house with settlement money from our divorce. This is his house. Actually, Tom has never owned this house. Tom has never been on the mortgage for this house. Tom has never been listed as a borrower or a co-signer or a responsible party for this property in any capacity. Truth that contradicts someone's fundamental assumptions often creates cognitive dissonance before it creates understanding. I don't understand, Rachel said slowly. If Tom doesn't own the house, then who? I own the house, Rachel. I bought it. I hold the mortgage. I pay the property taxes. And my name is the only name on every legal document associated with this property. So why did Rachel's complete bewilderment feel less like victory and more like watching someone realize that everything they thought they understood about a situation was built on incorrect assumptions? You own the house? Rachel's voice carried the particular disbelief of someone whose understanding of the world had just been fundamentally reorganized without warning. That's impossible. Tom told me he was buying a house. He said he needed to find a place where the kids would be comfortable during visitation. Tom Tom's face had gone pale, and he was studying his hands with the intensity of someone who realized that previous conversations might have created misunderstandings he hadn't intended to create. When someone realizes that their casual explanations have been interpreted as official statement, the conversation about communication becomes unavoidable. Tom did need to find a place where the children would be comfortable, I said gently, but finding a place and purchasing a place are different things. Tom found this house. I purchased it. Lily and Jake were still hovering in the doorway, their young faces showing the particular alertness children develop when they sense that adult conversations might affect their lives in ways they don't yet understand. Kids, why don't you go finish your homework while the adults sort out some boring paperwork stuff? Tom suggested with the forced lightness of someone trying to protect his children from complexity they weren't ready to process. When adult property disputes happen in front of children, managing their emotional security becomes as important as resolving the legal issue. But Mom seems upset, Jake said, demonstrating the emotional intelligence that develops in children who've lived through divorce and learned to monitor adult stress levels for survival purposes. Mom's just surprised about some information she didn't know before, I told him honestly. Sometimes adults have to work through complicated paperwork, but it doesn't change anything about your visits here or how much your parents love you. Lily looked between her mother's shocked face and my calm expression with the shrewd assessment of a 12-year-old who'd learned to evaluate adult conflicts for their potential impact on her own stability. Is someone going to have to move? She asked directly. Children of divorced parents often cut straight to practical concerns because they've learned that adult reassurances don't always align with actual outcomes. No one is moving anywhere, I said firmly. This is about clarifying who's responsible for making decisions about the house, not about anyone having to leave. Rachel was still staring at the property deed like it was written in a foreign language. Emma, if you own the house, then what's his role in, how does this arrangement work? Tom lives here as my husband. He contributes to household expenses. He helps with maintenance and upkeep, but the legal responsibility for the property belongs to me. When someone discovers that their assumptions about family arrangements don't match legal reality, processing the information often takes time. So when Tom said he was buying a house, he was looking for a house that we could live in together. I was the one with the financial capacity to actually purchase it. Tom finally found his voice, though it came out smaller than usual. Rachel, I should have been clearer about the ownership structure when we talked about it. I was focused on finding a place that would work for the kids' visitation, and I didn't think through how the financial arrangements might sound when I described them. Communication failures often happen when people focus on emotional goals without clearly explaining practical logistics. Rachel was processing this information with visible difficulty, her face cycling through expressions like someone trying to solve a math problem with missing variables. But you have keys to this house, she said slowly. You've been letting yourself in whenever you needed to set things up for the children's visit. Yes, I have keys. Tom gave them to me when you moved in together, because I needed to be able to access the house for child-related purposes. But if Emma owns the house, then Tom can't actually authorize access for other people without her permission. Property law often creates complications in family arrangements that seemed simple when emotional relationships were the only consideration. I removed another document from my folder, a copy of the house rules I'd drafted 6 months ago, but never shared because Tom had asked me to be patient while Rachel adjusted to our new family configuration. Actually, I tried to address the access issue several months ago. I drafted some house guidelines that would allow you to have keys for emergency purposes while establishing normal boundaries for non-emergency visits. House guidelines? Rachel's voice carried suspicion mixed with curiosity. Guidelines that would ensure you could reach the children if needed, while also ensuring that Tom and I had privacy and autonomy in our own home. Clear expectations documented in advance often prevent conflicts that arise from unstated assumptions about acceptable behavior. Tom was reading over my shoulder as I displayed the document, his eyebrows rising as he processed language he'd never seen before. Emma, you wrote up actual house rules? I wrote up suggested boundaries that would work for everyone. Emergency access for genuine child safety issues, advance notice for non-emergency visits, respect for our personal space and belonging. When did you write this? 6 months ago, right after Rachel rearranged our bedroom furniture while we were at work, because she thought the new layout would be better for Jake if he had nightmares during visits. Sometimes the specific incident that motivates boundary setting reveals how far situations have progressed before anyone addressed them directly. Rachel's face flushed red. I moved one chair so there would be a clear path to Jake's room if he needed comfort during the night. That was about child safety, not territorial dispute. Moving furniture in someone else's bedroom without permission isn't typically considered a child safety issue, regardless of the reasoning. But if Jake needs Rachel, Jake can walk 15 feet down a hallway to reach our room if he needs comfort during the night. Moving our bedroom furniture doesn't actually improve anyone's safety or comfort. When someone's justifications for boundary violations don't align with the stated goals, the conversation about true motivations becomes necessary. I was trying to make things easier for everyone. You were trying to make the house work the way you thought it should work, which is different from making things easier for the people who actually live here. The distinction landed like a small earthquake, shifting everyone's understanding of the dynamic that had been developing over the past 6 months. When control is disguised as helpfulness, naming the difference creates clarity that wasn't possible while everyone was focused on intentions rather than impact. So what happens now? Tom asked quietly. I looked at Lily and Jake, still standing in our doorway, watching their parents navigate adult complexities that affected their lives but weren't their responsibility to solve. Now we establish clear boundaries that work for everyone: emergency access for genuine emergencies, advance notice for other visits, respect for personal space and belonging, and consequences for boundary violations that protect everyone's rights. So why did finally naming the actual problem feel less like creating conflict and more like offering everyone a chance to build relationships based on respect rather than assumption? Consequences? Rachel's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd never considered that her behavior might have legal implications. What kind of consequences are you talking about? The afternoon had grown warmer, and our suburban neighborhood had settled into that Saturday lull where families retreat indoors for snacks and cartoons, and the kind of domestic peace that our front porch drama was definitely disrupting. When property disputes extend beyond comfortable conversation length, neighbors start to realize they're witnessing something more serious than a simple disagreement. The consequences that come with trespassing on private property, I said, removing another document from my folder, which is the legal term for entering someone's property without permission, regardless of your history with the location. Rachel stepped backward involuntarily, as if the word trespassing carried physical weight. Trespassing? I'm not trespassing. I'm visiting my children at their father's house. You're entering my property without my permission. The fact that your children visit here doesn't give you unlimited access rights. When someone's assumptions about family access meet actual property law, the learning curve can be steep. Tom was looking between Rachel and me with the expression of someone who realized that a situation he'd been managing diplomatically was actually a legal issue he'd been ignoring practically. Emma, are you saying Rachel can't have keys to the house? I'm saying Rachel can have keys for specific purposes with clear guidelines about when and how to use them. Emergency access for child safety issues? Yes. General access for convenience or personal preferences? No. I showed them the third document in my folder, a formal letter from my law office to Rachel, dated 2 weeks ago, but never sent. This is a cease and desist letter regarding unauthorized property access. I drafted it after you let yourself into our house last Tuesday, while Tom and I were at work to water the plants you'd brought over for the children's visit. Sometimes the accumulation of small boundary violations creates a pattern that requires legal intervention, even when no single incident seems worth confronting. Rachel was reading the letter with growing alarm, her face cycling through expressions as she processed the formal legal language describing her behavior. A cease and desist letter? Emma, this makes me sound like some kind of criminal. I was watering plants I brought to make the house more welcoming for my children, plants you brought without asking, placed without permission, and maintained by entering our home without notice while we weren't present. But they were for the kids. Rachel, good intentions don't change the legal reality of unauthorized property access. When someone discovers that their emotional justifications don't override legal boundaries, the conversation about respect versus control becomes unavoidable. Lily had been listening to this exchange with the intense focus of someone old enough to understand that adult conflicts could affect her living arrangements. Are you and Mom fighting about us visiting here? She asked, her voice carrying the particular worry of children who've learned that adult disputes sometimes result in changed custody arrangements. No, Sweetheart, I said immediately, this has nothing to do with your visits here, or how much your parents love you. This is about adults learning to respect each other's homes and privacy. But if mom can't come in the house, how will she help us get settled for visits? Children often focus on practical logistics when adult conflicts threaten familiar routine. Your mom can come in the house when she's invited, when there's an emergency, or when we've made plans in advance, just like any other adult who doesn't live here. The comparison seemed to help Lily understand the concept, though her face showed she was still processing how this change might affect her own experience. Rachel was staring at the cease and desist letter like it contained a message she couldn't quite decode. Emma, are you seriously prepared to have me arrested for trying to maintain a stable environment for my children? I'm seriously prepared to protect my legal rights as a property owner while finding reasonable ways to accommodate everyone's needs. Clear boundaries often sound harsh to people who've been operating without boundaries, even when the boundaries are designed to protect relationships rather than end them. What does that mean, practically? It means emergency access when there's genuine emergency, scheduled access when we've agreed in advance. No more letting yourself in whenever you feel like rearranging something or checking on something or improving something. And if I violate these boundaries, I removed the final document from my folder, a formal trespassing complaint form, already filled out but not yet filed. Then I file this complaint with the local police department, and you learn about property law through the court system instead of through conversation. Sometimes showing people the legal consequences of continued boundary violations is more effective than threatening those consequences. The silence that followed was profound. Even the neighborhood background noise seemed to have paused. No lawnmowers, no children playing, no cars passing on our usually busy streets. Tom was staring at the police complaint form like it contained information about a parallel universe where his family life had become a legal matter. Emma, are you sure this is necessary? Couldn't we just talk through the boundary issues without involving police? We've been trying to talk through boundary issues for 6 months. The talking hasn't resulted in changed behavior. When diplomatic solutions fail to create behavior change, legal solutions often become necessary to protect everyone's rights. Rachel finally looked up from the cease and desist letter, her face pale but determined. Fine, you own the house. You make the rules. You have the legal right to exclude me from property I helped make into a home. I have the legal right to establish reasonable boundaries that protect everyone's privacy and autonomy while allowing appropriate access for child-related needs. What's the difference? The difference is that I'm not trying to exclude you. I'm trying to include you in a way that respects everyone's rights and needs. Boundaries designed to protect relationships often look like restrictions to people who've been operating without limit. So what are these reasonable boundaries? Specifically, I pulled out a final document, the house guidelines I'd drafted months ago but never shared. Keys for emergencies only, 48-hour advance notice for non-emergency visits, respect for personal belongings and space arrangements. No entering the house when Tom and I aren't present unless there's genuine emergency. And if I follow these guidelines, then you maintain access for legitimate child-related purposes, while Tom and I maintain privacy and autonomy in our own home. Clear expectations often create more access than unclear assumption, because everyone knows what behavior is acceptable. Rachel studied the guidelines with the attention of someone reading a contract that would determine her future relationship with her children's living arrangement. These seem reasonable, she said slowly, though stricter than what I'm used to. They're stricter than what you've been practicing, but they're normal boundaries for most divorced parents. So why did Rachel's acceptance of reasonable boundaries feel like the moment when everyone finally understood the difference between family cooperation and property ownership? Normal boundary. Rachel's voice carried a note of genuine confusion, as if the concept of limits on her access to this property had never occurred to her as something other families might navigate. What do you mean by normal boundaries for divorced parents? The question revealed something important about how Rachel had been conceptualizing her role in Tom's life since their divorce, not as his former spouse with limited ongoing connection, but as a co-manager of family properties and decisions. Sometimes people reveal their assumptions about ongoing authority through the questions they ask when that authority is challenged. I mean that most divorced parents don't maintain keys to their ex-spouse's residence 2 years post-divorce. Most don't enter that residence without permission to rearrange furniture or water plants or reorganize closet. But this isn't just Tom's residence. This is where my children live half the time. Your children visit here every other weekend and Wednesday evening. They live here approximately 6 days per month out of 30. Quantifying visitation time often provides perspective on claims about primary residence that sound more extensive than they actually are. Tom was watching this exchange with the expression of someone who realized that conversations he'd been avoiding for months were now happening whether he participated or not. Emma's right, Rachel. The kids visit here, but they don't live here. Their primary residence is with you. But they need stability during transition. They need familiar environments and consistent routines. They can have familiar environments and consistent routines without their mother having unlimited access to rearrange their father's household. Child welfare arguments often get used to justify adult control issues that have more to do with managing anxiety than serving children's actual needs. Rachel was processing this information with visible difficulty, her face showing the particular strain of someone whose understanding of appropriate post-divorce behavior was being challenged by people who apparently had different standards. So other divorced parents don't maintain involvement in their children's alternative living arrangements? Other divorced parents maintain involvement in their children's welfare, not in their ex-spouse's household management decisions. The distinction was important, and watching Rachel work through it revealed how much boundary confusion had developed over the 2 years since her divorce. When divorce transitions aren't handled with clear guidelines, people often continue patterns that were appropriate during marriage but become problematic post-separation. I never thought about it as household management. I thought about it as ensuring continuity for the children. Ensuring continuity might mean asking Tom how the children are adjusting, not entering his house to reorganize their bedrooms according to your preferences. But if their bedrooms aren't arranged properly, Rachel, children are remarkably adaptable. They can sleep in bedrooms arranged differently from their primary residence without suffering psychological damage. Parents often underestimate their children's flexibility while overestimating the importance of environmental details that make adults feel more in control. Lily had been following this conversation with the shrewd attention of someone who understood that adult discussions about her welfare might not actually reflect her own experience of that welfare. Mom, I don't need my bedroom here to look exactly like my bedroom at home. It's kind of fun having 2 different rooms. But sweetheart, consistency helps children feel secure during transition. I feel secure because Dad and Emma are nice to me, not because the furniture is in specific places. Children often demonstrate emotional intelligence about their own needs that exceeds adults' theoretical understanding of what children require. Jake nodded agreement with his sister. Yeah, and it's weird when you move stuff around when we're not here. It feels like someone was playing in our rooms. The comment landed like a small revelation, suggesting that Rachel's efforts to create comfort for the children were actually creating discomfort by making them feel like their spaces were being managed by someone else. Good intentions that don't align with actual impact often reveal more about adult anxiety than about children's needs. Rachel's face showed genuine surprise at her children's responses. You don't like it when I organize your rooms here? We like it when you help us organize our rooms at your house, Lily said diplomatically. But these rooms feel like Dad and Emma's house, so it's their job to organize them, even if the organization isn't quite the way you prefer it at home. Mom, kids can handle different organization systems in different houses. We're not that fragile. Children often understand family boundaries more clearly than adults who've become invested in control dynamics that don't actually serve anyone. Tom was staring at his children with the expression of someone who was learning important information about their perspective that he'd never thought to ask about. Kids, have Mom's visits to organize things been helpful for you? Or confusing? Kind of confusing, Jake said honestly. Because we'll put something in one place, and then it gets moved to a different place, and we don't know which place is the right place. And it makes it feel like our rooms aren't really our room, Lily added. Like they're still Mom's rooms that we're just borrowing. When children feel like guests in spaces that are supposed to be their alternate homes, the environment isn't creating the security it's designed to provide. Rachel was absorbing her children's feedback with visible shock, as if their perspectives had never occurred to her as relevant data for evaluating her approach to maintaining consistency. I had no idea you felt that way. I was trying to help you feel more comfortable. We feel comfortable when the adults get along and when we know what the rules are, Lily said with the wisdom of someone who'd learned to navigate multiple households. We don't need everything to be exactly the same. What makes you feel most comfortable during visits here? I asked the children directly. When Dad and Emma ask us what we want for dinner instead of just making what we usually eat at Mom's house, Jake said immediately, and when they let us choose our own activities instead of trying to make everything like home. When it feels like we're visiting Dad and Emma's family instead of visiting a place that's trying to be exactly like Mom's house, Lily added. Children often prefer authentic relationships with different family configurations, rather than artificial attempts to replicate familiar environments. The revelations were accumulating like evidence in a legal case, demonstrating that Rachel's efforts to maintain control over the children's alternative living environment weren't serving anyone's actual needs. So you want me to stop organizing your rooms here? We want you to stop organizing anything here, Lily said gently but clearly. We want this to be Dad and Emma's house where we visit, not a second version of your house where you make decisions. Clear communication from children often provides the most compelling evidence for boundary changes that adults have been debating unsuccessfully. Rachel looked around our front porch, at the deed that proved she had no legal claim to this property, at the guidelines that established limits on her access, at her children who preferred autonomy to her management, at her ex-husband, who was nodding agreement with his daughter's assessment. I think I've been making this more complicated than it needed to be, she said finally. So why did Rachel's quiet recognition feel like the moment when everyone finally understood that love doesn't require control, and family cooperation doesn't require unlimited access to other people's spaces? 2 weeks after the front porch confrontation that changed everything, I sat in my office reviewing property deeds for other clients and thinking about how legal ownership creates security that goes far beyond financial investment. The folder of documents that had clarified our house situation sat in my desk drawer, no longer needed for emergency boundary setting but important as a reminder of why clear documentation matters. When you resolve a property dispute in your favor, the victory feels less like winning and more like restoring balance that should have existed all along. Rachel had returned her extra set of keys the following Monday, along with a handwritten note apologizing for overstepping boundaries and requesting a meeting to discuss new protocols for the children's visit. The note had surprised me with its genuine tone and lack of defensive justification for her previous behavior. People's capacity for growth often exceeds your expectation when they are motivated by love for their children rather than need to maintain control. The meeting had taken place at a neutral coffee shop, where Rachel and I had spent 2 hours drafting visitation guidelines that protected everyone's autonomy while ensuring the children felt welcome and secure during their time with Tom and me. I think I confused helping my children adjust with managing their environment, Rachel had said during that conversation. I was so focused on making everything familiar that I forgot to let them develop relationships with your family that were different from their relationships with mine. Self-awareness shared without defensiveness often creates space for collaborative problem-solving that wasn't possible during conflict. The new protocols were working well. Rachel called or texted before coming to pick up or drop off the children, giving us 15 minutes notice to finish whatever activities we were doing and prepare for transition time. Emergency situations still allowed immediate access, but emergencies were defined clearly. Medical issues, safety concern, or genuine child distress that required parental intervention. Clear expectations often create more flexibility than unclear assumptions because everyone knows what behavior is acceptable and what requires special circumstances. Tom had been different since the boundary conversation, more relaxed in his own home, less anxious about managing conflicts between Rachel and me. He'd also been more involved in establishing household routines that worked for our family instead of trying to replicate arrangements that worked for Rachel's family. I didn't realize how much energy I was spending trying to make everyone happy instead of just being authentic about how our family wanted to live, he'd told me last week. It's easier to be myself when I'm not constantly worried about whether Rachel will approve of our choices. When someone stops managing other people's emotions and starts focusing on their own, authentic relationships, the reduction in stress benefits everyone involved. The children had adapted to the new boundaries with the resilience that children often show when adult conflicts are resolved clearly rather than diplomatically avoided. Lily had started asking Emma for help with homework instead of waiting to ask Rachel during transition time. Jake had begun choosing different activities for visits with Tom than he did during time with Rachel. seeming to understand that different families could have different traditions. Children often thrive when they're allowed to have authentic relationships with each family configuration, rather than when adults try to maintain artificial consistency across households. But the most significant change had been my own relationship with the house that I'd owned for 14 months, but never quite felt belonged to me completely. Legal ownership doesn't automatically create emotional belonging when other people are treating your space as if they have equal authority over it. For months, I'd felt like a guest in my own home whenever Rachel was present. She would arrive for child transitions and immediately begin adjusting things, repositioning pillows on the couch, rearranging items on the kitchen counter, commenting on changes Tom and I had made since her last visit. Her behavior had made me feel defensive about decorating choices, hesitant to rearrange furniture according to our preferences, uncertain about my right to establish household routines that differed from what the children were used to at Rachel's house. When someone consistently treats your home as if it's partially theirs, you start to question your own authority over your living space. Now, with clear boundaries in place and Rachel respecting, the house felt like it belonged to Tom and me in ways that legal ownership alone hadn't created. Last weekend, I'd rearranged the living room furniture to create better conversation areas for when the children visited. I'd chosen new paint colors for the kitchen without worrying about whether they would be too different from what Lily and Jake were used to. I'd bought plants that I liked instead of considering whether Rachel would approve of my botanical choices. Emotional ownership of a space requires the freedom to make decisions about that space without external management from people who don't live there. The irony wasn't lost on me that as a real estate attorney, I'd understood the legal principles of property ownership perfectly, while struggling with the emotional dynamics that made those legal rights feel meaningful in daily life. Professional expertise in an area doesn't automatically protect you from personal challenges related to that area, especially when family emotions are involved. Tom had noticed the change in my relationship with our house almost immediately. "You seem more settled," he'd observed earlier this week. "More like this place actually feels like home instead of like a space you're managing." It does feel more like home when I don't have to worry about someone else reorganizing our belongings or critiquing our lifestyle choices. It's easier to relax and just live here. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that Rachel's behavior was making you uncomfortable. I was so focused on avoiding conflict that I didn't pay attention to how the lack of boundaries was affecting." Conflict avoidance often creates more stress than conflict resolution, especially when the avoidance requires someone to sacrifice their comfort for someone else's convenience. I understand why you wanted to avoid conflict. Divorced parents have to maintain relationships for their children's welfare, and that can make boundary setting feel complicated. But avoiding the boundary conversation made things more complicated, not less complicated. Usually does. Clear expectations prevent more conflicts than they create. Legal training teaches you that unclear agreements create more problems than clear ones, but applying that principle to family relationships requires courage that professional knowledge doesn't automatically provide. The house had become what it was always supposed to be, a space where Tom and I could build authentic family relationships with his children, create traditions that reflected our values and preferences, and establish routines that served our household's actual needs, rather than trying to replicate someone else's household management system. Home ownership becomes meaningful when you're free to create the living environment that serves your actual life, rather than managing space to accommodate other people's expectations. Tonight, Rachel would pick up the children after their Wednesday evening visit, and she would knock on the door instead of letting herself in. She would wait for us to invite her inside instead of assuming unlimited access. She would respect our household arrangements instead of suggesting modifications based on her preferences. So why did finally feeling at home in my own house feel like the most natural thing in the world, rather than like a victory that required celebration? 3 months after establishing clear boundaries around our property, Rachel and I found ourselves working together to plan Jake's 11th birthday party, demonstrating that respect for legal ownership could coexist with collaborative parenting in ways that served everyone's needs better than the previous undefined arrangement. When property disputes get resolved clearly, the relationships involved often become more functional rather than more distant. The birthday party planning had begun with Rachel calling to ask if Jake could have his celebration at the house with the big backyard, a request that acknowledged our property as belonging to Tom and me, while recognizing that it offered practical advantages for child-focused activities. We could handle all the food and decorations, Rachel had offered during our planning conversation, if you're comfortable with having the party at your place. The request demonstrated how much understanding had shifted over the past months. Rachel was asking permission rather than assuming access, offering to contribute rather than expecting to control, and acknowledging our ownership while seeking collaborative solutions. Respect for boundaries often creates more opportunities for cooperation than the absence of boundaries ever provided. I'd be happy to host the party here, and I'd appreciate help with food and decoration. Party planning isn't exactly my expertise. Mine either, honestly, but between the three of us adults, we can probably figure out how to make one 11-year-old happy. The conversation had been easy in ways that previous interactions with Rachel had never been, perhaps because we all understood our roles clearly now. Rachel as Jake's mother with specific parental authority, Tom and me as the adults responsible for our household with specific property authority. Everyone working together for Jake's benefit without competing for control over domain that belonged to other people. Clear authority often creates more collaboration than unclear authority because people can contribute their strengths without defending their territory. Tom had been amazed by how smoothly the party planning proceeded compared to previous attempts at family coordination. I keep waiting for conflict that isn't happening, he'd told me the night before the party. Rachel's being helpful without being controlling, you're being welcoming without being defensive, and I'm not stuck in the middle trying to manage everyone's feelings. That's what happens when everyone understands their role and respects everyone else's role. We can all focus on Jake's birthday instead of managing territorial disputes. When adults resolve their authority issues, children's events can actually focus on the children rather than on adult relationship management. The party itself had been a success that surprised all of us. Rachel arrived with carefully planned decorations that complemented our backyard space rather than trying to transform it into something else. She coordinated food that Jake actually wanted rather than food she thought he should want. She worked with Tom and me as a team rather than trying to direct us as staff. Collaborative events often work better than controlled events because multiple people can contribute their strengths without anyone having to manage every detail. Most importantly, Jake seemed to enjoy having all three of his primary adults working together smoothly instead of watching us navigate careful diplomacy around each other. "This is the best birthday party ever," he announced, after successfully hitting the piñata that Rachel had hung from our oak tree with Tom's engineering assistance and my height advantage. "Everyone's happy and no one's being weird." Children often provide the most honest assessment of whether adult relationship changes are actually serving their welfare. "What do you mean by being weird?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. "Like when adults are trying so hard to get along that they're not acting normal, or when they're being fake nice because they don't want to fight in front of kids." Jake's emotional intelligence had apparently been tracking adult authenticity more accurately than any of us had realized. Children often sense the difference between genuine cooperation and performative harmony, preferring honest relationships to carefully managed ones. "So today feels like genuine happiness rather than fake politeness?" Tom asked. "Yeah. Everyone's just being themselves and working together instead of trying to prove they're the best at being nice." Authenticity in family relationships often serves children better than artificial perfectionism, even when authenticity includes acknowledging different roles and boundaries. After the party, as we cleaned up streamers and collected gift wrap, Rachel had approached me with something that looked like genuine gratitude rather than obligatory politeness. "Thank you for hosting this here, and thank you for the boundaries you established 3 months ago." The second part of her statement surprised me. "Thank you for the boundaries?" I know it didn't seem like I appreciated them at the time, but having clear rules has actually made everything easier. I know what my role is, I know what's expected of me, and I know what I can count on from you and Tom. Clarity often feels restrictive initially, but becomes liberating once people understand how to operate within defined parameters. How has it made things easier? I don't have to guess whether I'm overstepping. I don't have to worry about whether you're secretly annoyed by something I've done. I don't have to manage relationships through hints and diplomacy. Rachel's explanation revealed that unclear boundaries had been creating stress for her too, not just for Tom and me. Boundary confusion often creates anxiety for everyone involved, not just for the people whose boundaries are being violated. And the children seem happier with the clearer arrangement. They do. They've stopped asking me questions about whether you and Tom are upset about things I've done, or whether they need to be careful about mentioning differences between our households. When adults resolve their territorial issues, children no longer need to manage information carefully to avoid triggering adult conflict. What kind of questions were they asking? Whether they were allowed to tell me if you rearranged their rooms, whether they should ask you before telling me about activities you'd planned, whether it was okay to like different things at different houses. The revelation was sobering. Jake and Lily had been monitoring adult tensions and trying to protect all of us from information that might create conflict. Children often become emotional traffic directors when adult boundaries are unclear, trying to prevent relationship collisions through careful information management. I didn't realize they were feeling responsible for managing our adult relationship. Neither did I, until the boundaries got clear and they stopped asking those kinds of questions. Now they just tell me about their visits here the same way they tell me about school or friends. When adult relationships become stable, children can focus on their own experience rather than on protecting adults from difficult emotion. As Rachel packed up the remaining party supplies and prepared to take Jake home, our interaction felt natural rather than carefully managed. We were three adults who'd learned to navigate shared responsibility for children without competing for control over each other's households. Same time next month for Lily's party? Rachel asked. Assuming she wants to have it here. We should probably ask her what she prefers rather than assuming. Good point. Let the children make decisions about their own celebrations rather than adults deciding what would be most convenient for adult relationship management. So why did this easy cooperation feel like the most significant achievement? Not because anyone had won or lost, but because everyone had learned to contribute their strengths without defending territory that didn't belong to them? 6 months after the boundary conversation that changed our family dynamic, I was sitting in my law office drafting property agreements for other divorced families when Rachel called with a request that demonstrated how much our understanding of appropriate roles had evolved. Emma, I know this might sound strange, but could you give me some legal advice about a property issue I'm dealing with? When someone who previously challenged your property rights asks for your professional expertise, it signals trust that transcends personal history. What kind of property issue? My ex-husband before Tom, Jake's biological father, has been letting himself into my house to pick up child support documents instead of arranging meetings or using mail. I need to know how to establish boundaries without affecting his visitation rights. The irony was perfect and painful. Rachel was experiencing exactly the boundary violations she'd been creating in our household, and she was asking for help from the person who'd taught her about property rights through direct confrontation. Life often provides symmetrical learning opportunities that illuminate previous behavior through current experience. How long has this been happening? About 8 months. Ever since I gave him a key for emergency access when Jake started staying there occasionally. But he's been using it for convenience rather than emergency. Sounds familiar. Rachel's laugh held genuine self-awareness. I deserve that. And I understand now why you were so insistent about clear boundaries. Having someone treat your home like their workspace is incredibly stressful. Personal experience with boundary violations often creates empathy that theoretical discussions couldn't provide. What specific behaviors are you concerned about? He lets himself in when I'm not home to collect paperwork from my office. He rearranges Jake's room when he thinks it's not organized properly. Last week, he reorganized my kitchen cabinets because he thought they were inefficiently arranged. The parallel to Rachel's previous behavior in our house was so exact it felt like a teaching moment designed by the universe. How does Jake feel about his father reorganizing his room? He hates it. He says it makes him feel like his space isn't really his space, that it belongs to whoever wants to control it most. Rachel paused, and I could hear her processing the connection between her son's current experience and her own previous behavior in our— Emma, is this how Lily and Jake felt when I was reorganizing their rooms at your house? Self-awareness often arrives through parallel experiences that illuminate the impact of previous behavior from a different perspective. According to what they told us during the boundary conversation, yes, they said it made them feel like guests in spaces that were supposed to be their alternate home. God, I put them through exactly what Jake's dealing with now. No wonder they seemed relieved when you established clear rules. Recognition of how your behavior affected others often requires experiencing similar treatment yourself. What do you need from me, legally? a cease and desist letter, and advice about how to set emergency-only access without seeming like I'm trying to interfere with his relationship with Jake. Same approach we used for our house. Clear guideline, documented expectation, consequences for violations that protect your property rights without affecting his parental rights. Legal solutions that work for one property situation often translate effectively to similar situations with different people. I spent an hour drafting a cease and desist letter for Rachel that mirrored the one I'd created for our situation months earlier, with modifications for her specific circumstances and relationship dynamic. This feels strange, Rachel admitted as I explained the document. Using legal strategies you developed to handle my behavior, to handle someone else's similar behavior. Property law doesn't change based on who's violating boundaries. The same principles apply regardless of the relationships involved. Will you send this from your office? As my attorney? Professional relationships can coexist with personal ones when both people understand their respective roles clearly. Yes, but our attorney-client relationship is separate from our family relationship. Legal advice is confidential regardless of our personal history. I appreciate that. And Emma? Thank you for not saying, "I told you so" about the boundary issues. Experience is usually a more effective teacher than lecture. You're learning through your own situation, which creates understanding that my explanations couldn't provide. Growth often happens through direct experience rather than through other people's warning, even when the warnings prove accurate. 2 weeks later, Rachel reported that the cease and desist letter had worked exactly as intended. Jake's father had returned his keys and was now arranging meetings for document exchange instead of entering her home without permission. The letter was firm, but not hostile, she told me during our next transition conversation. It established clear boundaries without affecting Jake's visitation schedule. How did Jake respond to the changes? He's much happier. He says his room feels like his room again instead of like a space that someone else controls. Children often express relief when adults resolve territorial conflicts that were affecting the children's sense of security in their own spaces. Rachel, can I ask you something personal? After everything we've been through, I think we're past worrying about personal questions. What made the difference in your understanding of boundary issues? Was it the legal documentation, or experiencing violations yourself, or something else? Rachel considered the question thoughtfully. Honestly, it was seeing my children relax when clear rules were established. They stopped being anxious about adult territorial disputes and started just enjoying their time at both houses. Children's well-being often provides the most compelling motivation for adults to change behavior patterns that aren't serving family relationships. And experiencing boundary violations myself helped me understand that good intentions don't justify overstepping other people's property rights, even when you think you're being helpful. Do you think our family relationships are healthier now with clear boundaries than they were before? Definitely. Everyone knows their role, everyone respects everyone else's authority, and the children can focus on enjoying time with their families instead of managing adult conflict. Clarity often creates more harmony than diplomatic avoidance, even when establishing clarity requires difficult conversation. Emma, would you be willing to help other divorced families with property boundary issues? I've been talking to other parents who are dealing with similar problems. Professional expertise developed through personal experience often becomes valuable for helping others navigate comparable challenges. I'd be happy to consult on property boundary cases involving divorced families. It's an area where legal clarity can prevent a lot of emotional stress, and where personal experience makes professional advice more practical than theoretical knowledge alone. So why did Rachel asking for my help with her own boundary issues feel like the moment when our relationship finally became genuinely collaborative rather than territorially competitive? 1 year later, the first anniversary of our property boundary conversation was marked not with celebration, but with the quiet satisfaction that comes from watching family relationships function smoothly because everyone understands their role and respects everyone else's authority. The most successful resolutions are the ones that become invisible because they create stability rather than requiring ongoing management. Jake and Lily were spending their usual Wednesday evening with us, homework spread across our kitchen table while Tom helped with math problems and I reviewed their book report. The scene was domestic and peaceful, in ways that felt natural rather than carefully orchestrated. Children comfortable in a space that belonged to adults who welcome them without needing to control every detail of their experience. Emma, Can you help me with this essay about family traditions? Lily asked, looking up from her notebook with the easy confidence of someone who felt welcome to ask for help. What kind of family traditions are you writing about? How different families can have different traditions, and that's good instead of confusing. Like how we have Pancake Wednesday here and Pizza Friday at Mom's house, and both traditions are special because they're different. Children often understand family diversity more clearly than adults who worry about maintaining consistency across households. That sounds like a great topic. What's your main point? That families work better when each house gets to do things its own way instead of trying to be exactly the same. Like how you and Dad let us choose our own bedtime stories, and Mom reads us the same story every night. Both ways make us feel loved. Lily's essay demonstrated emotional intelligence about family dynamic that had taken all the adults in her life months to develop through difficult conversations and legal documentation. Wisdom often emerges in children before it develops in the adults who are trying to protect them. Jake, what are you learning about family relationships in your experience? That adults are happier when they don't have to worry about other adults being upset about little things, and when adults are happier, kids get to just be kids, instead of being worried about whether grown-ups are fighting. Children often serve as emotional barometers for family health, reflecting adult relationship stability through their own behavior and stress level. The insights the children shared revealed how much our family dynamic had improved once property boundaries eliminated territorial disputes and allowed everyone to focus on authentic relationships rather than managing other people's emotions. Clear boundaries often benefit children more than adults because children no longer need to navigate adult conflicts that they have no power to resolve. Tom looked up from Jake's math homework with the relaxed expression of someone who was no longer mediating conflicts between the most important people in his children's lives. It's hard to believe that a year ago we were having front porch arguments about house keys and furniture arrangement. Do you think we could have resolved the boundary issues without the legal documentation? Probably not. The property deed made the conversation about facts rather than opinion. Hard to argue with county records. Legal clarity often provides objective foundation for subjective disputes, allowing people to focus on solutions rather than debating basic facts. What do you think made the difference in everyone accepting the new arrangement? The children's feedback. When Lily and Jake said they preferred clear rules to diplomatic confusion, all the adults had to acknowledge that our territorial disputes weren't serving anyone's actual needs. Children's perspectives often cut through adult complications to identify what actually works versus what adults think should work. Rachel arrived for pickup precisely on time, knocking rather than entering, waiting for invitation rather than assuming access, engaging in the kind of normal transition conversation that had replaced the careful diplomacy of our earlier interaction. How was homework tonight? Lily's writing an essay about family traditions, and Jake finished his math without any major trauma, I reported, though he might need to review fraction concepts before tomorrow's quiz. I'll work on fractions with him before bed. Thanks for helping with homework. I know Wednesday evening tutoring wasn't part of the original visitation plan. Genuine gratitude shared for services that aren't obligatory often indicates healthier relationship dynamics than formal politeness about expected duties. It's not tutoring, it's just helping kids with school like any adults would do. Part of them feeling comfortable here. Still, I appreciate that you invest in their education rather than just managing their visit. Recognition of authentic care versus obligation demonstrates understanding of the difference between service and control. As Rachel gathered the children's backpacks and coordinated plans for Jake's upcoming soccer game, our interaction felt collaborative rather than territorial, focused on the children's needs rather than adult authority issues. Rachel, how are your property boundary issues with Jake's biological father working out? Much better since the cease and desist letter. He schedules meetings now instead of letting himself into my house, and Jake feels more secure in his own space. Legal clarity helping with emotional dynamics? Exactly. Same principle as our situation. Clear expectations prevent more conflicts than they create. Patterns that work in one family situation often translate to other relationships when the underlying principles are sound. After Rachel and the children left, Tom and I cleaned up homework materials and settled into our evening routine, moving through our house with the easy familiarity of people who felt genuine ownership of their space rather than defensive management of contested territory. Emma, what did you learn from this whole experience about property law, about family relationships, about yourself? The question deserved thoughtful consideration because the past year had taught lessons that extended far beyond real estate transactions into fundamental principles about human relationships. Major conflicts often teach principles that apply to much more than the specific circumstances that created the original problem. I learned that legal ownership only becomes meaningful when you have the emotional freedom to exercise that ownership authentically. Documentation protects your rights, but clear communication makes those rights feel real in daily life. What else? I learned that boundaries don't prevent relationships, they make authentic relationships possible by eliminating the energy drain that comes from managing territorial dispute. And about family dynamics specifically, that children often understand what they need better than adults understand what children need, and that collaborative parenting works better when everyone's authority is clearly defined rather than diplomatically negotiated. Wisdom gained through difficulty often feels both surprising and obvious. Surprising because it challenges previous assumptions, obvious because it aligns with deeper truths about human nature. Do you think our family is stronger now than it was before the boundary crisis? Definitely, not because we solved a problem, but because we learned to communicate clearly about difficult topics instead of avoiding them diplomatically. Relationship strength often comes from developing skills for addressing challenges directly rather than from avoiding challenges successfully. Any regrets about how we handled the situation? Only that we didn't establish clear boundaries sooner would have saved everyone's stress and created space for authentic relationships earlier. So why did this quiet evening feel like the most profound success? Not because we'd defeated anyone, but because we'd created a foundation where everyone could contribute their strengths without defending territory that belonged to someone else. 5 life lessons that changed everything. First, legal ownership only becomes meaningful when you have the emotional freedom to exercise that ownership authentically. Documentation protects your rights, but clear communication makes those rights feel real in daily life. Second, boundaries don't prevent relationships, they make authentic relationships possible by eliminating the energy drain of territorial disputes and allowing people to focus on genuine connection rather than conflict management. Third, children often understand what they need better than adults understand what children need. Collaborative parenting works best when everyone's authority is clearly defined rather than diplomatically negotiated around children's supposed fragility. Fourth, good intentions don't justify boundary violation. Impact matters more than motivation, and respect for other people's space creates healthier relationships than helpful interference in areas that aren't your responsibility. Fifth, clear expectations prevent more conflicts than they create. Uncertainty about roles and limits generates anxiety for everyone involved, while defined boundaries allow people to contribute their strengths without defending territory that doesn't belong to them.